Ryan Carter stepped cautiously through the ruined corridor of the abandoned space station. The metal walls were covered in long-dead vines, remnants of an ancient infestation that had long since turned to dust. His boots echoed against the grated floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He adjusted his oxygen levels in his helmet, taking a deep breath. The station had been dead for decades, orbiting the remnants of a shattered moon. No records explained why it had been abandoned, only vague warnings about an unknown threat, the kind of mystery that made it valuable for scavengers like him. His flashlight flickered against the walls, revealing faded insignias of a long-forgotten alien species. Ryan had explored hundreds of derelict ships and stations, but something about this one made his skin crawl. The air was thick, heavier than it should be, as if something unseen was watching him. He tapped his wrist-mounted scanner, but no life signs appeared. Just silence. Then, a noise, soft, barely more than a whisper of movement. Ryan froze, gripping the pulse pistol strapped to his thigh. He turned, sweeping his light across the hall. Nothing. Just the wreckage of a station left to rot in the void. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was here. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave, but he had a job to do. Pushing forward, he entered what seemed to be the station's central chamber. The walls were covered in strange, intricate carvings. Alien script he didn't recognize. A circular platform sat in the center, surrounded by broken glass and long-dried stains that looked disturbingly like blood. The air was colder here, thick with something old, something waiting. His breath fogged against his visor. A whisper. Ryan spun around, heart pounding. He wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving slowly, unnaturally. She was tall, almost unnervingly so, her body wrapped in tattered fabric that barely clung to her thin frame. Her hair, long and wild, floated around her like it had a life of its own. But it was her eyes that made Ryan step back, a deep, glowing red, piercing through the darkness like twin beacons. She staggered toward him, her movements both desperate and eerily smooth, like a predator weakened by hunger. Her skin was ashen, her lips slightly parted, revealing the tips of elongated fangs. A vampire. Not the kind from old Earth legends, but something far worse, something born from the void between stars. Ryan raised his weapon instinctively. "Stay back." She stopped, her breathing ragged, her gaze locked onto him. And for the first time, he saw something behind the hunger. Desperation. Pain. A silent plea. "You're human," she whispered, her voice cracked from disuse. Her lips trembled as she took another step closer. "Your blood. It's the only thing that can save me." Ryan's grip tightened on his weapon. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape before it was too late. But then the station rumbled beneath his feet, and behind him, the door slammed shut, locking him inside with her. His escape was gone, and he wasn't sure if she was his captor or his only chance to survive. Ryan kept his weapon steady, his breath slow and controlled. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to focus. The woman, if she even was one, stood before him, swaying slightly, her crimson eyes locked onto him, with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The way she looked at him wasn't just hunger. It was something deeper, something desperate. She took another slow step forward. Ryan tightened his grip on the pistol. "Don't come any closer." She hesitated, her fingers twitching like she was fighting against some inner instinct. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, her gaze flickering between his face and his arm, where a small cut from his earlier exploration had left a smear of dried blood on his sleeve. "I won't hurt you," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "I can't." Ryan wasn't convinced. He had read stories, seen reports. There were species in the universe that fed on others. Predators disguised as helpless creatures. He had no reason to believe she was any different. Still, she didn't attack. The station groaned, the ancient metal shifting under some unseen force. The door behind Ryan remained sealed, a thick, blast-proof hatch that had locked automatically when he entered. His wrist console blinked with an error message. The system wasn't responding. He was trapped. The woman pressed a trembling hand against her stomach and exhaled shakily, as if even standing was an effort. He noticed now how gaunt she was, how her skin clung too tightly to her bones. Her hair, though thick and flowing, was tangled, matted in places. She was starving. "How long have you been here?" Ryan asked, lowering his gun just slightly. Her lips parted, but for a moment, no words came. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know." Ryan's jaw tightened. He didn't like that answer. The air in the station felt wrong. The deeper he breathed, the more he noticed it. A strange thickness, a weight in his lungs that hadn't been there before. He checked his oxygen levels. Normal. Then why did it feel like something was pressing against his ribs? The woman took a slow breath, steadying herself. "You're human," she said again, softer this time, like she was trying to convince herself it was real. "You have to understand. I don't want to do this, but I don't have a choice." Ryan lifted his gun again. "You always have a choice." Her expression twisted with something between sorrow and frustration. "Not when your body turns against you." She touched a trembling hand to her temple. "Not when every moment without it is agony." Ryan glanced at the carvings on the walls. He had seen alien scripts before, but these were strange. Some of the markings looked burned into the metal, almost like they had been seared into the structure itself. Symbols curled and twisted in ways that made his eyes ache if he stared too long. The more he looked, the more a strange idea took shape in his mind. "This place," he said slowly, "it's not just a station, is it?" The woman let out a weak, bitter laugh. "No." Ryan exhaled sharply. He had walked into something far worse than a derelict ship. He had walked into a prison. His stomach turned as the pieces clicked together. The warnings, the lack of records, the eerie silence. This wasn't an abandoned station. It was a tomb. Whatever had happened here, whatever had been locked away, it had been meant to stay that way. She was never supposed to leave. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. "Who put you here?" Ryan asked. Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, finally, she whispered, "My own kind." Ryan frowned. He hadn't expected that. She took a slow step back, her hands curling into fists. "I wasn't always like this. I was different. Once. Before the sickness." Her gaze flickered with something haunted. "Before I needed human blood to survive." Ryan's stomach tightened. "Sickness." She nodded faintly. "A mutation. A curse." She let out a slow, shuddering breath. "I was one of the first to change. They feared me. They feared what I would become. So they locked me here, deep in this forgotten place, and left me to wither." Ryan studied her, searching for any sign of deception. But if she was lying, she was a damn good actor. The station groaned again, a deep, shuddering sound that rattled through the walls. Ryan's wrist console flickered, displaying a brief error message before shutting down entirely. His HUD glitched. The temperature dropped sharply. Something was happening. The woman stiffened. She turned her head slightly, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she whispered, "It knows you're here." Ryan's pulse spiked. "What knows I'm here?" he demanded. She took a step closer, not with hunger this time, but urgency. "The thing that keeps me trapped. The thing that doesn't want me to leave." Her voice dropped, almost trembling. "It's waking up." Ryan's breath hitched. The walls shook violently. The carvings glowed faintly, pulsing with a sickly crimson light. The air grew heavier, pressing down on his chest like an invisible hand. Something ancient, something alive. Ryan moved without thinking, grabbing her wrist and pulling her toward the control panel. "If we're getting out of here, we need to move. Now." The woman hesitated for only a moment before nodding, her fingers curling around his arm like he was the only solid thing left in the universe. The station rumbled again. This time, it wasn't just metal shifting. It was something else. Something waking up beneath their feet. Ryan's grip on her wrist was firm, but not painful. It was the grip of someone who knew they were running out of time. The station groaned, the deep, hollow sound reverberating through the ancient metal like a warning. The dim emergency lights flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the chamber. The symbols on the walls pulsed with an eerie red glow, as if something beneath the surface was stirring, sensing the presence of a living being after all these years. The woman, Selara, moved with him, though her steps were unsteady. She was weak, struggling against the very thing keeping her alive. Ryan could feel her fingers twitch against his arm, a silent battle playing out inside her between hunger and restraint. He didn't trust her, not completely, but right now, she wasn't the enemy. Something else was. They reached the control panel at the far end of the chamber, but Ryan knew before he even looked that it wouldn't work. The station's systems were ancient, long since degraded. His wrist console was still unresponsive, and the thick steel doors remained sealed shut, trapping them inside the prison. "Can you override it?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Selara exhaled shakily, stepping closer to the console. She ran her fingers over the cracked surface, her touch hesitant, almost reverent. "It's not about overriding," she murmured. "This place doesn't operate like human technology. It's alive, in its own way." Ryan frowned, glancing at the symbols again. He had assumed they were some kind of ancient writing, but now he wasn't so sure. They pulsed like veins, spreading across the walls, shifting ever so slightly, like they were responding to the energy in the room. "Then how do we get out?" Ryan asked, glancing over his shoulder. The oppressive weight in the air was growing, the temperature dropping further. Selara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed a hand against the console. Her fingers trembled slightly as she closed her eyes. The moment her skin touched the surface, a low vibration rippled through the metal, and the symbols on the walls flared brighter. Ryan tensed. "Wait, what are you?" Before he could finish, the floor beneath them lurched. A deep, guttural sound resonated through the chamber, like a massive heartbeat coming to life. The lights flickered again, and suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. Ryan spun around, raising his weapon. The darkness at the far end of the chamber moved. At first, he thought it was just the flickering lights playing tricks on his eyes. But then something unfurled from the walls. A shape. No, many shapes. Tendrils, dark as the void, slithering from the corners of the room. His breath caught in his throat. Not cables, not machinery. Something alive. Selara staggered back, her breathing ragged. "It's waking up too fast. We have to move." Ryan wasn't about to argue. The first tendril lashed forward with inhuman speed. Ryan barely had time to dive out of the way as it slammed into the console, shattering it with a sickening crunch. Sparks erupted, and the entire chamber shook as the presence in the room grew stronger. Selara clutched her head, gritting her teeth. "It's the warden." Ryan fired his pulse pistol at the writhing mass of tendrils. The blue energy rounds struck their target, but instead of burning through, the tendrils absorbed the shots, the light vanishing into the inky black surface. The thing fed on energy. "Of course it does," Ryan muttered under his breath. Another tendril lashed toward him. He twisted out of the way, grabbing Selara's arm and pulling her toward the far wall. "Tell me you have another way out of here," he said. Selara clenched her jaw, scanning the chamber. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed faster now, reacting to the presence of the warden. "There," she said, pointing to a barely visible hatch on the opposite side of the room. Ryan didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward it, Selara close behind. The tendrils lashed out again, but this time, they weren't just attacking blindly. They were aiming. One of them caught Ryan's leg. He hit the floor hard, pain shooting up his side as the tendril coiled around his ankle. dragging him back toward the center of the chamber. Selara turned sharply, her red eyes flashing. The hunger was there, but so was something else, determination. She darted toward him, her speed inhuman despite her weakness. Before Ryan could react, she sank her nails into the tendril wrapped around his leg, tearing through it with a hiss of black smoke. The severed end thrashed violently before retreating into the darkness. Ryan pushed himself up, breathing hard. "You could have warned me you were that fast." Selara didn't respond. She just grabbed his arm and hauled him toward the hatch. The two of them reached the sealed door. Ryan scanned the edges, looking for any kind of manual release. Selara pressed a hand against it, muttering something in a language he didn't understand. The symbols around the hatch flared to life, and with a deep groaning sound, the door slid open. They didn't waste time. Ryan pulled himself through, and Selara followed, just as another tendril slammed into the wall where they had been standing. The door sealed shut behind them. Silence. Ryan leaned against the cold metal, trying to catch his breath. His heart was still pounding. Selara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "That thing," Ryan finally said, voice hoarse. "It wasn't just a security system, was it?" Selara slowly shook her head. "It was my jailer," she said quietly. "And now it knows I'm trying to escape." Ryan exhaled sharply. "Great, so we pissed it off." Selara turned her gaze toward the corridor ahead. It was narrow, with more of the glowing symbols lining the walls. The air was heavy, but not as suffocating as the chamber they had just escaped. "This way," she said. "There's a place deeper inside." "A lab." Ryan frowned. "A lab?" Selara hesitated. Then, for the first time since they had met, she looked at him not with hunger or desperation, but with something close to hope. "There might be a cure," she said. Ryan stared at her. A cure. For her condition. For the hunger. He didn't know why, but a part of him wanted to believe it was possible. Another part of him, however, knew that whatever waited for them deeper in this station, it wouldn't let them leave without a fight. Ryan followed Selara through the dim corridor, the walls pulsing with faint red light, casting eerie shadows that moved like living things. The air was thick, carrying a strange metallic scent that made the back of his throat itch. The deeper they went, the more he felt it, the sensation of being watched, of something unseen shifting just beyond his perception. Selara moved ahead, her long, tangled hair flowing behind her like ink in water. Her movements were still unsteady, but there was a new urgency in her steps. She wasn't just running from the warden anymore. She was running toward something. Ryan wasn't sure if that was better or worse. His pulse pistol felt cold in his grip. He had reloaded it after their last encounter, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't do much against whatever had taken over the station. That thing, the warden, wasn't just a security system or some rogue guy. It was something ancient, something patient. It had been here for centuries, feeding on the energy of this place, waiting for something, or someone, to disturb it. Now it was awake. They reached a large set of reinforced doors at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, these weren't covered in glowing symbols. Instead, deep scars ran along the metal, as if something had tried to claw its way in. Selara placed her hand on the surface. The door vibrated slightly beneath her touch, but didn't open. She frowned, pressing her palm harder against it, muttering something under her breath. Ryan couldn't understand the words, but they carried weight, like an old song with a forgotten meaning. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep mechanical groan, the doors slid apart, revealing a vast chamber beyond. Ryan stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. The lab was massive, far larger than he had expected. Rows of containment pods lined the walls, filled with murky, stagnant fluid. Some of them were shattered, their contents long gone. Others remained intact, their glass streaked with age. Strange consoles flickered with faint, dying lights, their screens displaying unreadable data. Ryan moved closer to one of the intact pods. Inside, a figure floated in the thick fluid, humanoid in shape, but wrong. Its skin was too smooth, its eyes black and unseeing. The thing's fingers twitched slightly, though whether it was still alive or just reacting to the flickering power of the station, Ryan couldn't tell. "This place," he murmured. Selara didn't respond. She was standing near the far end of the room, staring at a single pod that looked different from the others. It was larger, its glass reinforced with heavy plating. Unlike the rest, the fluid inside was still clear, and the body within. Ryan's stomach twisted. The figure in the pod looked exactly like Selara. Not just similar, identical. Selara's hands clenched into fists. So it was true. Ryan stepped closer. "What do you mean?" She exhaled slowly. "Before they imprisoned me here, before the hunger took over, there were whispers among my people that the sickness wasn't natural, that it was created." She reached out, running her fingertips along the glass. "This confirms it. They were experimenting on us, trying to change us." Ryan studied the pod, his mind racing. If that was true, then the station wasn't just a prison. It was a testing ground. He turned to one of the consoles, pressing a few buttons at random. To his surprise, the screen flickered to life, displaying a set of logs in an alien script. The data was fragmented, corrupted by time, but one word appeared over and over again. Project Vita. Ryan frowned. Vita. That means life, doesn't it? Selara nodded. They weren't just trying to imprison us. They were trying to make something better. A deep rumbling echoed through the chamber. Ryan's gut twisted. They had spent too much time here. The station was reacting. He turned back to Selara. "Can we use any of this? Can we stop the hunger?" She hesitated. Her crimson eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Maybe, if the research is still intact." Before she could say more, the lights flickered violently, and the room shook with a force that nearly knocked them off their feet. Ryan's heart slammed in his chest. "That's not just the station." Selara's eyes darkened. "No, it's him." The door behind them sealed shut, and from the walls, the pulsing red light turned black. A voice, deep and echoing, filled the room. "You should not have come here." Ryan turned sharply, gun raised, but there was nothing, just the writhing shadows slithering along the walls, watching them. The warden wasn't just awake now. It was here. Selara grabbed Ryan's wrist. "We have to move. Now." The pods along the walls burst open, spilling their grotesque contents onto the floor. The creatures inside, twisted, half-formed versions of Selara's species, jerked to life, their empty black eyes snapping toward them. Ryan fired the first shot. The pulse blast struck one of the creatures in the chest, but instead of going down, it twitched, convulsed, then started moving even faster. Selara hissed. "They're feeding off energy. Don't shoot." Ryan gritted his teeth. Of course. The first creature lunged. Ryan barely dodged in time, its claws slashing through the air where he had been standing seconds before. Selara moved with inhuman speed, grabbing Ryan and shoving him toward the far side of the lab. "There's another exit. Come on." The creatures shrieked, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they pursued them. Ryan sprinted after Selara, dodging the grasping limbs that tried to drag him back. The floor was slick with spilled fluid from the broken pods, making every step treacherous. Selara reached the far wall, slamming her fist against a panel. A hidden door slid open, revealing the dark passage beyond. Ryan didn't hesitate. He dove through, and Selara followed, the door sealing behind them just as the creatures crashed against it. Silence. Ryan pressed his hands against his knees, breathing hard. Selara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "That was close," Ryan muttered. Selara didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "The cure isn't in the lab," she said. "It's in me." Ryan looked at her sharply. "What?" Selara exhaled, her crimson eyes glowing faintly. "I wasn't just the first to change." She touched her temple. "I was the first to survive it." Ryan's stomach dropped. The hunger. The mutation. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was the key. Ryan stared at Selara, his pulse still hammering from their narrow escape. His mind raced, trying to process what she had just said. The cure wasn't in the lab. It was in her. The dimly lit passageway stretched ahead of them, its walls slick with moisture, as if the station itself was sweating. The air smelled stale, thick with something unnatural. The further they got from the lab, the stronger the sensation of being hunted grew. The warden wasn't giving up. If anything, it was closing in. Ryan pressed his fingers against his temples, exhaling sharply. "You survived it. The mutation. What does that mean?" Selara hesitated, her crimson eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite name. Guilt? Fear? She leaned against the wall, gripping her arm as if holding herself together. "I wasn't supposed to live through it," she admitted. "The others, they changed, but they lost themselves. They became mindless, driven by hunger. I was the only one who kept control." Ryan frowned. "Why?" She let out a slow breath. "Because I'm different. I don't just need human blood. I can adapt to it. My body doesn't reject it like the others. It changes me." Ryan stiffened. "Changes how?" Selara's gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw something new in her expression. Something she had been hiding. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked softly. "The air in the station, pressing against you. The way your breath got heavier the moment you stepped inside." Ryan swallowed. He had noticed it. At first, he had assumed it was just the station's deteriorating atmosphere. But now he wasn't so sure. "I can manipulate life," Selara continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The energy around me. When I take human blood, it doesn't just sustain me, it changes what I am. It makes me stronger." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Stronger how?" Selara exhaled, closing her eyes. Then the entire corridor trembled. Ryan stepped back, eyes wide as he watched the walls around them shift, the air itself vibrating as if responding to her presence. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "This station," he muttered, "it's reacting to you." Selara opened her eyes, and for a split second, they weren't just red. They were glowing, burning with an inner light that was alive. Ryan took a breath, forcing himself to focus. "So that's why they locked you up," he muttered. "You weren't just some experiment gone wrong. You were something they couldn't control." Selara let out a bitter laugh. "They were afraid of what I could become." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his mind still struggling to catch up. "If you can control life, then why do you still need blood?" Selara's gaze dropped to the floor. "Because I haven't mastered it yet. The hunger is still stronger than I am." She hesitated. "But if I learn to control it, I might be able to stop it. Not just for me, but for the others." Ryan exhaled slowly. "You think you can reverse what happened to them?" Selara's fingers clenched into fists. "I have to try." Before Ryan could respond, the station lurched violently. The floor beneath them cracked, and a deep guttural rumble echoed through the corridor. Ryan stumbled, catching himself against the wall as the air around them grew thick with something unseen. Then, from the darkness ahead, a voice slithered through the air. "You will not leave." Ryan's stomach turned to ice. The warden. The walls shuddered, and suddenly, the corridor was no longer just metal and wires. It was alive. Dark, twisting tendrils of shadow slithered out from the walls, pulsing with the same inky blackness that had tried to consume them in the lab. The air grew colder, sharper, as if reality itself was unraveling. Ryan grabbed Selara's arm. "Run." They bolted down the corridor as the walls behind them collapsed inward, the tendrils tearing through metal like paper. The station was folding in on itself, warping as the warden's presence grew stronger. Ryan skidded to a halt as they reached the end of the passage. Another sealed door. No panel, no console, just solid metal. He turned to Selara. "Can you open it?" She placed her hand against the door, her face tightening in concentration. The air around her shimmered, but nothing happened. "I need more time," she gasped. Ryan spun around. They didn't have time. The tendrils were moving faster now, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Ryan raised his pistol on instinct, but he already knew it wouldn't work. Selara gritted her teeth, pressing both hands against the door. The glowing symbols from before flared to life, burning against the metal surface. Then, just as the first tendril lunged, the door blasted open. Ryan grabbed Selara and dove through just as the corridor behind them imploded. The moment they landed on the other side, the door slammed shut, sealing the tendrils away. Silence. Ryan lay on his back, panting, his heart still hammering against his ribs. Selara sat beside him, her breath ragged, her body trembling. Ryan pushed himself up. That was too close. Selara didn't respond. She was staring at her own hands, her fingers trembling slightly. Ryan frowned. "What is it?" Selara slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "It's changing me again," she whispered. "I can feel it." Ryan clenched his jaw. "You need blood, don't you?" Selara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The way she was holding herself, the way her breathing had become uneven. It was clear. Ryan exhaled, then pulled off his glove. "Take what you need." Selara's eyes widened. "Ryan, I..." "Do it," he said firmly, "before we both die down here." Selara hesitated for only a moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, she leaned forward, her lips parting, her breath warm against his skin. Her fangs pierced his wrist. Pain flared, sharp, but brief. Then, something else. A strange warmth spread through his body, not draining, but changing. For a moment, Ryan's vision blurred. His heart pounded in his chest, but not from weakness, from something new. Selara pulled back, gasping, her pupils dilated. Her body trembled as energy rippled through her once ashen skin glowing faintly. Ryan clenched his fists, testing his strength. He didn't feel weak. He felt different. Selara stared at him, her lips parted slightly, realization dawning in her expression. Ryan wiped the blood from his wrist, meeting her gaze. "What just happened?" he asked. Selara swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted. But deep down, they both understood. Something had changed between them. And whatever it wasn't human. Ryan's breath came slow and measured as the heat from his wound faded. His wrist, where Selara had bitten him, no longer ached. In fact, it didn't even feel like a wound at all. Instead, there was a strange sensation, something alive, spreading through his veins like a second pulse. Selara was still staring at him, her red eyes wide, her body trembling slightly as she processed what had just happened. Her skin had changed. It looked healthier, stronger, more alive. The sickly paleness was gone, replaced by a faint glow beneath her flesh, as if something dormant inside her had reawakened. But it wasn't just her. Ryan could feel something shifting inside him too. His limbs felt lighter, his senses sharper. The dull ache in his muscles from running, from fighting, had vanished. Even the weight in his lungs, the heavy, suffocating pressure that had clung to him since entering the station, was gone. He clenched his fists experimentally. His heartbeat was steady, strong. Selara's voice was hushed when she finally spoke. This isn't supposed to happen." Ryan flexed his fingers. "What isn't?" Selara hesitated. She ran a hand over her own arm, as if feeling the new strength coursing through her body. Then she looked at him. Really looked at him. Her crimson eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You're still standing." Ryan frowned. Should I not be? Selara shook her head. When I drink human blood, it weakens them. Even a small amount should leave you dizzy, drained. But you. She reached out, hesitantly brushing her fingertips over his wrist, where her bite had been. There was no wound left. No mark. You healed, she whispered. Ryan inhaled sharply. She was right. There wasn't even a scar, like it never happened. He took a step back, shaking his head. What does that mean? Selara's lips parted, but she didn't answer. Because she didn't know. A deep rumble shook the station, snapping them both out of their trance. Ryan turned, pulse hammering. The walls trembled violently, the once glowing rooms fading to black. The air grew thick again, but this time, it wasn't just a presence pressing against them. It was anger. The warden had felt the shift, and it did not like it. Ryan's instincts screamed at him to move. We need to get out of here, now. Selara nodded sharply. Whatever she was feeling momentarily pushed aside. She turned toward the passage ahead, leading the way into the unknown. The corridor was narrower than the others, the walls slick with condensation. The dim emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that twisted unnaturally. Ryan felt the shift in the air. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Then, they entered another chamber. It was different from the lab, different from anywhere else in the station. The room was ancient, older than everything else. Massive roots, thick and blackened, snaked through the walls and floor, pulsing faintly as if alive. Strange crystalline structures jutted from the ground, glowing with dim, flickering light. In the center of the room was a throne. No, not a throne. A containment seat. And sitting in it, a corpse. At least, Ryan thought it was a corpse. The figure slumped in the seat was humanoid, but its skin was blackened and cracked, as if burned from the inside out. Its chest had been split open, ribs protruding at odd angles, but instead of organs, there was only darkness, a hollow void where life should have been. Ryan swallowed hard. What the hell is this place? Selara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. The origin. Ryan narrowed his eyes. Origin of what? She turned to him, her crimson gaze burning. The curse. Ryan stiffened. The implications hit him all at once. This wasn't just a prison. It wasn't just a lab. This was where it started. Whatever had turned Selara's people into what they were now, whatever had created the hunger, had begun here. Before he could process it further, the air shifted violently. The corpse moved. Ryan took a sharp step back, hand flying to his weapon. The body in the seat let out a shuddering exhale, a breath that should not have been possible. Its head twitched, then slowly, agonizingly, it lifted. Empty black sockets where eyes should have been locked onto them. Selara stiffened. It's not dead. Ryan didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist. We're leaving. The figure in the seat suddenly jerked forward, its mouth stretching open in an unnatural, silent scream. The room exploded in darkness. Ryan grabbed Selara and ran. The chamber behind them collapsed, the roots lunging out like grasping hands. The thing in the seat rose, but they didn't look back. Ryan pulled Selara into another corridor, dodging as tendrils of living blackness lashed out, trying to ensnare them. The warden wasn't just after them now. It was in rage. They burst into another hallway, this one leading upward. Ryan didn't know where it went, but it didn't matter. They had to keep moving. Selara stumbled, her breath ragged. The energy she had absorbed from Ryan was keeping her on her feet, but he could tell she was still recovering. Ryan grabbed her by the waist, half dragging her forward as the shadows behind them screamed. Then, a light. A massive circular hatch at the end of the corridor. A way out. Ryan lunged forward, slamming his hand against the door's release panel. Nothing. Locked. He cursed, turning to Selara. Can you? Before he could finish, a violent shockwave tore through the corridor. Ryan was thrown forward, slamming into the metal hatch. Pain flared through his body, but he barely had time to register it before the shadows engulfed the hallway. Selara hit the ground beside him, her fangs bared, her breath ragged. The glow in her eyes had returned, but it wasn't enough. The darkness pulsed, closing in. Ryan moved without thinking. He grabbed his knife, not his gun, but his blade, and without hesitation, he slashed his own palm open. Blood dripped onto the metal floor. The station reacted instantly. The walls shuddered, the tendrils of darkness recoiling violently. The warden's presence screamed, but Ryan barely noticed, because Selara was staring at him, eyes wide. Ryan pressed his bleeding hand against the hatch. The symbols on the metal flared to life. The door unlocked. Ryan looked at Selara, breathless. "It's not just you," he said. "It's me too." The realization hit them both at the same time. Ryan wasn't just human anymore. Selara's curse was becoming his. The massive hatch groaned as it slid open, the stale air of the station rushing out like an exhale from something ancient. Beyond the threshold, a long metallic bridge stretched into the darkness, leading to what appeared to be an external docking bay. Ryan barely had time to register the sight before the warden's furious scream tore through the station behind them. The darkness surged forward, tendrils thrashing like living chains, desperate to pull them back into its grasp. The floor beneath them trembled as the station itself seemed to come alive, shifting and warping in unnatural ways. Ryan grabbed Selara's wrist and ran. She was moving, but slower than before. The energy she had absorbed from his blood had kept her from collapsing, but it wasn't enough. Whatever was happening to the station, to them, was taking its toll. Ryan didn't have time to think about what it meant, about why the symbols on the door had responded to his blood just as they had to hers. All that mattered now was escaping before the warden consumed them both. The bridge trembled beneath their feet as they sprinted across it. Ahead, a rusted airlock stood partially open, its emergency lights flickering in protest. It was their only way out. Behind them, the darkness rushed forward, closing the distance in seconds. The warden wasn't going to let them leave. It had waited too long, held this place together for centuries, feeding off the suffering of the cursed souls trapped inside. Ryan and Selara weren't just prisoners anymore. They were a threat. Ryan reached the airlock first and slammed his fist against the manual override panel. The door groaned, but didn't open fully. "Come on, come on." Selara stumbled beside him, her breath ragged. The glow in her eyes flickered like a dying flame. Then the warden struck. A tendril of pure darkness lashed out, coiling around Selara's ankle. She gasped as it yanked her backward, her fingers clawing at the ground as she struggled to resist its pull. Ryan didn't think. He lunged, his hand wrapped around her wrist, and for a moment they were both caught in the struggle. Selara being dragged into the abyss, and Ryan holding on with everything he had. Her eyes met his, wide with something he had never seen in them before. Fear. She wasn't afraid of death. She wasn't afraid of the hunger. But in that moment, she was afraid of losing herself to whatever force was trying to reclaim her. Ryan gritted his teeth and tightened his grip. Not happening. The warden screamed, its voice no longer a whisper in the air, but a full-bodied, deafening roar that shook the very metal beneath them. The tendrils tightened, pulling harder. Ryan dug in, but his strength was failing. Then, without warning, Selara gasped. Her body seized, her fingers clawing at Ryan's wrist, not to push him away, but to hold on to him even tighter. The glow in her eyes flared brighter. And then it spread. Ryan felt it first as a burning sensation in his veins, like fire threading through his bloodstream. His heartbeat accelerated, his vision blurred for half a second, and then everything snapped into clarity. His strength surged. His muscles coiled with a force that wasn't his own. The weight of the tendrils lessened, not because they had weakened, but because something inside him had changed. His fingers tightened around Selara's wrist, and without thinking, without doubting, he pulled. The tendril around Selara's ankle burned away, hissing into nothingness as she was ripped free from the warden's grasp. Ryan barely noticed. His head pounded, his breath came in sharp gasps, but he felt no pain. Selara collapsed against him, panting, her fingers trembling against his chest. What was that? Ryan's jaw clenched. He didn't know. He didn't want to know. All he knew was that they needed to move. He shoved his palm against the emergency override panel, and this time, the airlock door obeyed. With a deafening hiss, it slid open, revealing a docking bay partially exposed to space. The cold void loomed just beyond. But there, at the far end of the platform, was a ship. Small, damaged, but still functional. Ryan didn't hesitate. He pulled Selara to her feet, and together they ran. Behind them, the warden let out one final, piercing shriek, and the station collapsed inward. Ryan could feel it. The sheer force of the station's very fabric folding into itself, as if it was trying to devour the last of its escaping prey. Metal groaned, gravity warped, the very air screamed as they reached the ship. Ryan didn't wait for permission. He slammed his hand against the access panel, dragging Selara inside, just as the world caved in. The doors sealed behind them. Ryan stumbled forward, reaching the pilot's seat with shaky hands. He barely knew how to fly an Earth-standard ship, let alone an ancient alien relic, but right now, it didn't matter. He pressed every button he could find, hoping one of them would get them the hell out of there. Selara, still breathing hard, pressed her palm against a glowing interface, and suddenly, the ship responded. The engines roared to life. Ryan barely had time to strap in before the ship blasted out of the docking bay, tearing through the collapsing station's gravity field, rocketing into open space. And then, silence. Ryan's body sagged against the seat, exhaustion slamming into him like a brick wall. His hands were still trembling. His veins still felt like they were on fire. Selara sat beside him, her expression unreadable. She was watching him, studying him, the way a scientist might observe an experiment. Ryan exhaled sharply. "We made it." Selara didn't answer, not right away. Instead, she reached out, her fingertips brushing against his forearm. His skin burned beneath her touch, not with pain, but with awareness. Something new, something alien. She met his gaze, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. "You're changing," she whispered. Ryan's chest tightened. He already knew. Something had happened back there, something neither of them understood. The hunger that had once been hers alone, the mutation that had created her kind, that had destroyed them, was now inside him too. He was no longer just human. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what that meant. Selara inhaled deeply, turning her gaze back toward the endless void stretching out before them. "What happens now?" Ryan muttered. Selara's lips parted, but this time she had no answer. Their fight for survival was over, but their story had only just begun.